For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Author Anthony Schneider joins me to discuss his debut novel, A Quiet Kind of Courage. You were born in South Africa but now live in New York and London. How old were you when you left South Africa, and what made you or your parents decide to leave?
I was 12 and it was my parents' decision, and they thought that South Africa was not the country that they wanted their kids growing up in. And you know, as a 12-year-old, I think certainly then, probably now, I was quite politically aware. I was very aware of the atrocities of apartheid. On the other hand, I was quite a happy kid surrounded by friends and family, so you know, it was a little bit kicking and screaming that I left.
Why did you choose to write about South Africa and exile in your debut novel? Can you tell us a bit more about where your ideas came from?
It started really with, I was interested in a person, he's now called Henry, and what I was interested in initially was someone who moved a lot. So by the time he got to a country that he called home, South Africa, he'd actually moved twice. So he moved from Lithuania to Liverpool to South Africa, calls that home, and then is forced to leave the country that he calls home. That sort of idea of character then began to sort of inform the plot, the story of the book. And then it started sort of bouncing up against ideas of my own leaving a place, my own feeling of exile and being an immigrant and not quite American and all of that. So, but it started in sort of a different place and morphed into the ideas that were closer to home for me.
Can you tell us about the title of the book?
Interesting. The title, I have to say firstly, was chosen by my agent. And what it refers to is in the book, the book is largely about Henry, my grumpy octogenarian former ANC activist now living in New York, and his grandson Saul, who comes to South Africa ostensibly to make a documentary. Quite late in the book, Saul is sort of pondering the meaning of courage, because he's always thought that his grandfather was so courageous, and he was a, you know, sort of a foot soldier in the ANC. But he's also then thinking about others, like this woman he's found out about who is a more unsung hero in the ANC, and he starts thinking about his father as well, who, you know, didn't fight any wars or change any nations, but has been a great dad, sort of still is a great dad for him. He thinks, and I'll read it so I don't have to try to paraphrase. So Saul has just, and it's very quick, Saul has just phoned home and he's talked to his dad and told him he loves him because he's had this sort of realization about his dad. And he thinks to himself, you don't change history if that's not what you set out to do. Maybe you raise a family instead, give your son a home, an education, or shepherd your daughter to safety, not yank them out of their lives and separate them from their mothers when they're kids. Maybe that's a quiet kind of courage too.
Your characters include presumably fictional characters like Henry and Saul Wachland, as well as historical figures such as Joe Slovo, Walter Sisulu, and Nelson Mandela. Is the novel part fact and part fiction?
Look, it's primarily fiction. It's a work of fiction, and I thought that it would be, you know, as I sort of wrote about it, and Henry was sort of in the lives of these, you know, the real ANC leaders, I thought I'll just leave them who they are for a couple of reasons, or, you know, a bunch of reasons. One is they're amazingly interesting characters, so just on that alone, and they're on stage for so little that you can use the real people. Two, you know, I did have the idea of, I do want to sort of pay tribute to these, you know, incredibly courageous heroes who sort of changed the course of a nation. And I think you can do that better by calling them by their real names. And third, it allowed me to kind of weave, you know, real people and real places into my fictive narrative. And so that, you know, I thought it made the whole thing stronger and had more verisimilitude doing sort of both of those at the same time.
Is A Quiet Kind of Courage related to your own life in any way? And if so, how?
In the most broad strokes, it's a little bit autobiographical in its themes and ideas, but it's not, this is not my story. You know, Henry's taking part in the struggle is something I was not involved in. It happened before I was born. That said, I share some similarities with this guy. We like Bach, we like Beethoven, we don't like tofu, we don't like green peppers. And I think beyond that, we both have experienced a kind of exile, being an immigrant, you know, being in a new person in a country are sort of not quite American. So we have a lot in common, but I wouldn't say it's autobiographical.
What can readers expect from you in the future?
Initially, a lot of grumbling about what I'm writing or probably not writing. And then, you know, as I'm sort of picking around with characters again, trying to do the same thing all over again, I'm interested in characters who move, and I think this time it might almost be the opposite. I'm sort of interested in maybe an American family, 3 siblings who are in different countries. So they've come from America, but maybe one is there and one's in Europe and one's in Africa, and that's sort of as far as I, you know, care to elaborate.
That was novelist Anthony Schneider discussing his new novel, A Quiet Kind of Courage.